Hello everyone and welcome to this steaming dookie bomb of a camera, the Minolta Prod-20s. And now that I've appropriately set the tone and tempo of this video, let's get through this so I can get rid of this thing. This is the worst camera I've ever used. Like, I really wanted to like this camera. I'm like, it looks really neat. It's big, but it's not huge for this. And like, it has a glass lens. It ticked a lot of like really neat little carry-around camera boxes, and it's awful. Okay, the Minolta The Minolta Prod-20s is a 35mm compact-ish, and I say compact-ish because by compact camera standards, it's enormous. It's an autofocus point-and-shoot camera, meaning it has autofocus. You just point it at a scene and it will focus on something, maybe if you're lucky, and take a picture. It needs film that has DX codes, and it can read any DX code from 100 to 1000 ISO. If you don't have a DX code on your film, I believe it defaults to 100 ISO. The manual indicates that the light meter on this is what's called subject weighted. Believe that probably means center weighted. Most people, this is a broad statement, but it's not unfair or untrue. Most people who use point and shoots center frame their subjects, and so a center weighted meter would bias the metering towards the subject. The shutter speeds range from 1/40th to 1/150th of a second, with some sources indicating that speeds between those are achieved and are also achievable, meaning that there's a range of shutter speeds. But the manual only specifies those two. So I suspect that only those two exist, but on this camera there's a secret third shutter speed called the shutter is just open all the time when it chooses to be and doesn't close properly. Anyway, so if you have a properly working one of these, let me try that one again. If a properly working one of these exists in the world, it's safe to assume that there are only two shutter speeds. The flash sync speed on this is unknown, probably 1/40th, and fundamentally this is a Freedom 200 series camera in a fancy body. That's right, you can polish a turd, but guess what? It's still a turd. The camera model history for this was that this was an entry-level or casual user camera for somebody looking for a stylish but simple photographic experience. The closest focus on it is 0.95 meters. The lens is relatively slow. The specs on it are f4.5 down to f22 with a 35mm focal length. It's not what I would call a technically precise lens. The camera design, and also the way that the manual is written, is a style that's designed to hearken to the Art Deco era of classic cameras in Classic Camera Manual, the book that came along with this design. So as I noted earlier, it can use any film from 100 to 1000 ISO, but it groups films into two camps: slow, which is an ISO of 400 and slower, and fast, which is an ISO of faster than 400. And basically what that means is that it's not going to do a different aperture for 100 or 200 ISO. It's going to treat your 100, 200, and 400 ISO films the same. It will treat your 500, 640, 800, and 1000 ISO films the same. The viewfinder is very simple, with just an image frame and two parentheses inside, and the parentheses mark the autofocus metering area. So basically you see this and then there's a couple of parentheses like that. That is one, by the way. Fairly nice thing about this is that the viewfinder is very simple. It just tells you the scene and what's going to be in focus. It is a pretty basic, the lens, I did mention it's not technically precise. It's a fairly basic 4.4 35mm f4, probably a Tessar design lens. Tessars can be really good and really reliable. It can be. And they can also not be really good. As I said, this is also large by compact standards. It's definitely not pocketable unless you have cargo pants. So it's really designed to be a style camera more than a really nice carry-around camera. It was made by Minolta in Japan in 1990 only. There are some blessings in the world, I suppose. If you have your Prod-20s, we're going to go through it and talk about what all of the different things on the camera are. And we're going to start here on the top. Model number, Prod-20s. I got to assume the apostrophe is just a grammatical mistake. Anyway, serial number. This is your frame count window. This is your lock and unlock dial right here. And is there even yeah, there's a little tiny indicator on the knurled grip here. Locked. Red is ready to fire. Shutter release button right here. Technically on the sides, these are your camera strap lugs so that you can connect a camera strap to it. Now on the camera's front is where we have most of the stuff. The grip, of course, self-timer lever, self-timer light. This is your lens up here. These are your two autofocus windows. There's an autofocus beam in each one of these, and the camera uses triangulation to calculate your autofocus distance. Viewfinder window, flash, and that little light, that little cell next to the flash is your light meter reading cell. So if your finger blocks that, you're going to get very inaccurate light meter readings because that's what your camera needs to know how much light is in the scene. The camera's back is fairly simple. We have the film back release switch right here, and we'll see inside the camera in a minute, and the viewfinder. On the camera's bottom, we have the tripod socket here, which is plastic, and we have the film bottom lock and unlock right here. And when you open this, you just lift it off. Just lift it off. There we go. And that's where the battery's going to go. I'm just going to leave this off because it's kind of a pain, and we'll get to the battery in just a couple minutes. Then we're going to go inside of the camera next. To get inside of the camera, you push down on that release, and now we can access the inside of the camera, which, as you can see, has had the light. I've replaced the light seals in it because the light seals in this were completely shot. So when I got this camera, the first roll of film came back. It was light leaks galore, and I just thought, okay, I'll replace the light seals. They are super sticky. That'll fix the problem. No, it did not. Anyway, film take-up area over here, and you can see this orange indicator indicating where to load the film leader to. This is the film take-up spool, and this little roller helps keep the film being moved through the camera. Shutter area. This advance sprocket right here is how the camera knows the film is advancing, and it does things like the frame count window and so forth. DX code readers, film rewind gear. This is your film cassette chamber. Here is your film cassette retaining spring so that when you load film, it's properly lined up. This is your film pressure plate right here that sandwiches the film here so that it stays flat and receives properly focused light. We'll pretend that this camera can focus anything. And then we have a film roller here that goes into this part of the take-up area to help keep the film moving through the camera smoothly. To load film, you take your 35mm film. You do want to have film with the DX code on it, and you slide it into the film cassette chamber like I just showed you, which is you angle the bottom of the film in, drop it into place, pull out a leader, and feed the leader in over here. Now, I'm actually going to take this film out because when this takes it, this film's getting very hard to retrieve from this cassette, but I'm going to tell you what happens after you load your film. Basically, you close the camera back, and then if you have a battery in, it will advance the film, and every time you take a photo, it will then advance the film as well. So, and then when you're done, it will automatically rewind the film. There is, as you might have noticed, no force rewind button on this camera, which means once you reload film into it, you are finishing that roll of film before you can put another one in. Oh, one note I forgot to mention about the frame counter is that if you load the film incorrectly, the camera will let you know because the frame counter will not go beyond 0 even after the film stops winding. If you load film and it's loaded correctly and it winds for a bit and stops, that will stop at frame 1. So having seen all of the things on the camera, how to load film, one thing to note is that being a fully electronic camera, you need to have a battery installed before it can do anything. This uses a 223 battery. I actually don't have any 223 batteries, and a 223 is just two 123 batteries in a combined plastic housing that is then overpriced. If you buy a 223 battery and after it's dead you cut it apart very carefully at this end with an X-Acto knife, you can put a piece of tin foil down here, connect the two 123 batteries that you are going to drop into it, and then put a little piece of tin foil or something down here to extend that terminal. And you can now use two 123 batteries. If anyone does 3D printing and there is not yet a 3D printed option to make a 223 housing, that would be something very useful. Anyway, you put the battery in here, drop the bottom in place, turn it to lock, and if this battery is not dead, it should work. There it goes. Oh, you can actually kind of see the autofocus. The lens move a little bit with the autofocus. That's kind of neat. One real quick note about this camera, a problem that many Minoltas of this vintage have, and this one specifically, this camera and this camera model have, is capacitor drain. If you are going to have one of these and you find that your 223 battery dies overnight, as I did the first time I got this, it's because the capacitor is draining the battery very quickly. So don't leave your batteries in this camera overnight. If you think you have a capacitor drain issue, you'll want to take your batteries out every time you're done using your camera. Literally, this camera will drain a perfectly good 223 to completely dead in about 8 hours. The 223 battery is good for approximately 40 24 exposure rolls, and that assumes that the flash is used 50% of the time. If you convert that to 36 exposure rolls, that means you can get about 24 36 exposure rolls, assuming 50% flash use out of a battery. Without the flash, you can get significantly more life out of the battery. That is, if your capacitor doesn't destroy your battery. That's not a great number. Either way, neither of those numbers are particularly good. So while we're talking about things with this camera, specifically the flash, let's talk about how to use the flash. You don't really have a whole lot of flexibility. The flash will fire if it wants to. It won't fire if it doesn't want to. The flash is good from 0.95 meters to 3.3 meters with 100 ISO film, and from 0.95 meters to 6.6 meters with 400 ISO film. You can extend that to 800 ISO film, assuming that you could probably get about 10 meters of flash. Probably not. Honestly, for a flash this bright, that's really going to be pushing it. I suspect with anything faster than 400, you're not really going to have effective flash use much beyond that 6.5 meter mark, simply because this flash is going to just diffuse too much. So, rule of inverse squares, the further away from the flash you are, every time you double, you lose a lot of flash power. It's like 1/9 the flash power for every doubling, something like that. So by the time you get to 6.6 meters, you've lost a lot of flash power. To use the self-timer, all you have to do is flip this down and then press the shutter button, and this light will stay on. I believe this should start to blink in just a few seconds, but then after the self-timer is done, the camera will take a photo. There you go. It doesn't blink. It just turns off and takes a photo. So that's how that works. Some notes on the viewfinder. It has no parallax correction. So if your subject is a meter in front of you, which is the closest focus point, you're not going to get any parallax correction in this. You'll have to manually compensate for that by sort of lifting up your camera a bit for subjects which are closer than 3 meters. Now that we've basically gone over everything with this camera, let's talk about how to take a picture with it. You're going to look through the viewfinder. You're going to use the area inside of the parentheses to compose your focus. You're going to have to press the shutter button, and that will lock focus, which will allow you to recompose without the focus point or meter reading changing. And then, oh, that was bright. That was really bright. And then you can take your photo. You also don't have to recompose. You can just take your photo and you're good to go. And that's how you take a single exposure. But what about double exposures? You can't. This camera automatically advances the film afterwards. It has built-in double exposure prevention. You're not going to get a double exposure from this camera. So I do have some things not to do with this camera. The big one is don't leave the battery in the camera overnight, because if you have the capacitor drain issue, it will absolutely destroy a very expensive battery. The next one is don't let the camera get wet. It's not weather sealed, and the electronics will be absolutely trashed if the camera gets wet. There we go. Don't leave it in your car. I mean, it's plastic. It has plastic components that could be affected by heat or cold and cause them to warp or crack, and also lubricating oils, which could get into the wrong place if they get thin or just become really gummy if they freeze, and that can mess up your mechanism as well. In fact, that is probably why the shutter on mine hangs open all the time. It's just, I suspect that the issue with this is that there's gummy lubricating oil in it. So, honestly, the best tip I've got for you with this camera, buy a Minolta Freedom 200 series instead. Same internals, same optics, same functionality, way, way, way less expensive because it has a standard Freedom 200 housing. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next video.